let's pick up again. So then you got security documentation. So you have a policy, which is mandatory, and then you have procedures and standards. The policy is the overall goal. Then you have step-by-step procedures to do something, and then standards, like the particular brand names and products your company is going to use. And then you have guidelines and baselines, which are discretionary. And then, so those are the basic components of security policies. So the policies are the strategic plan, assigning responsibility and requirements and risk levels. This is the high level overview of what you're all going to do. And then below that, you're going to have a variety. You have an overarching general policy, and then you have little policies handling just parts of the company, like regulatory and advisory and so on, through your company. So organizational policies, issue specific, like just email, just employee termination, and so on, tied to systems like firewalls. And you've got regulatory policies, which will be how you're going to meet requirements from industry or legal standards, advisory policies, and informative policies. So you have processes that step how you're going to do things. Then these lead to procedures. The procedures that are detailed step-by-step instructions of how you're going to do things. And these, of course, have to be updated. All these policies do, but the procedures have to be updated all the time. Like I write a lot of hands-on projects for my other classes, and they take constant updating because things keep changing. Then you have standards. These are the requirements for the technology. This is why companies typically do something like everybody must use only Microsoft Windows, only Windows 10, only Microsoft Office, only the Microsoft chat client. You know, that's typically what you do. You have specific products you must use, and they won't let you lose anything else, because then they can make sure it's all updated so they're, and, you know, patch the known security vulnerabilities and all that. If you let people just put on any kind of junk, then you lose control. And then you have guidelines, which are just more flexible recommendations, and baselines, which define a reference point so you can measure the state of your security or other configurations and then see how it changes. So, all right, let's take a look at some Cahoots. Go back to the browser, and let's see if the Cahoots, that looks good. All right, so we're up to 1F. And they're not in order because that's how they punish you for using the free version. 1E, we're done with. 1F, there we go. Oh, people come in really fast. Good. I'll give it a few more seconds. All right. So, which one has step-by-step instructions? The procedures. All right. What's the most common policy? Most of them are advisory. All right. And which one is compliance with industry or legal standards? Okay, that's regulatory. Good. No, what? Oh, it should have been regulatory. Huh, I must have had the wrong answer marked. Well, that's why these things are extra credit. Sorry about that. Can't change it now, but anyway, I don't think it affects the relative ranking though, because everybody got it wrong because you all got it right, but my answer was wrong. Anyway, CT I've seen before. And Daniel and Todd are new. All right. Daniel sounds like a real name, and so does Todd. So hopefully my grader will be able to figure out who you are. Good. I see. Okay, good. Anyway, so we got one more section to go through. And let's go back to the slides. Good. All right. So business continuity. The point of this is how you handle a disaster. Most businesses have no business continuity plan at all. They're like a mom and pop restaurant. And if a disaster happens, like the building burns down, they will just quit and go out of business. So that is one way to run a business. But if you do have a business like that, then you can't really play with the big people. You can't have a contract with a major corporation or government because you got to be more reliable than that. So you have to have business continuity planning. How are you going to handle things like pandemics, fires, floods, scandals, financial collapses, So you make a plan. The continuity plan is the plan that handles many different possible problems, including the disaster recovery plan. The disaster recovery plan will be how to deal with a specific issue, like a malware infection that takes down all your servers, or a fire, or something like that. So you do this by you perform a business impact analysis, and that determines the maximum tolerable downtime for all the parts of your business. Because when you're going to try to recover after a major outage, you don't bring everything back all at once. You take the most critical assets and restore them first, and the things that you can do without for a while, you let them wait until later. And then you do a risk analysis, including vulnerability analysis. So you'll have a contingency plan, a business impact analysis. Then you identify preventive controls, create contingency strategies of how to deal with various things like backups and recovery. And then you have a contingency plan, which will be what you do in some temporary period while recovering. Then you have to test your plan, train people on it, and have exercises. And then you have to maintain your plan. You have to keep updating it and making sure it's still going to work because, of course, you keep changing everything. And so all this work is just to prepare so that when you have a disaster, your company can survive the disaster. All right, then you got personnel screening policies. This is a big issue. Something like 80% of resumes now have lies on them because most companies don't check your resume. They don't actually call your references. So I hear a lot of scandals of someone being in charge of a major company like Yahoo or the San Francisco hospital system, and then it turns out that they don't actually have the degree they're supposed to have. So they either fire them or they send them off to night class to get that degree or something. And it shows that they aren't really screening their candidates properly. So there's quite a few agreements you have to do when you're first joining a company. And then when you offboard, they should carefully make sure that you understand the requirements. They remove all your credentials. They make sure you're not sneaking company data out. And, it's an important issue and it's very commonly overlooked. So there's a lot of cases where a company fired somebody and then the next week he hacked them because his password still worked. Yeah, the US president showed a serious problem with offboarding this time. They told him it was time to leave and he sort of refused to leave and refused to admit it was time to leave and kind of made a mess by not leaving in an organized way. That's a very similar issue. Anyway, so then you got job rotation is another security measure where you don't let people keep doing the same job forever. They have to rotate to another job and someone else comes in. And the point is a lot of people work too much, never take vacations, and never move because they found a scheme for fraud. They're able to redirect some money to themselves and then somehow cover up the traces. And if somebody else took over that job, that would all come out. Separation of duties is a similar control where you do not let one person authorize an important task. One person does the work and some other person has to also sign off on it. And the task cannot be done without both of them signing off on it. That way, no one person can commit an egregious mistake or an act of fraud. You'd have two people looking at it, so it's more likely to be captured. And then here's some risk management. So you've got threat agents, are people who might attack your system, people who want to do you harm. And so they perform some threat, something bad they can do to you. They can do that because they exploit a vulnerability. And that creates a risk, which is a possible financial loss. The risk hurts your assets, and that is because that creates financial exposure for your company. So you have to implement safeguards to stop it. And this goes around and around. Then you consider what other people might attack you. And you can start anywhere and just go around. Some people start with threats. You read the newspaper and they say this bad thing might happen, that bad thing might happen. A list of bad things that might happen are threats, but only when you consider what are our vulnerabilities, what are our risks, and what are our assets, then you can decide your exposure, which is how much money you would really lose. That is quantified risk now, as opposed to just a threat, which is just a scary thing to worry about. This is now boiled down to how much will it really hurt us, and then you can calculate what defenses are worth putting in. Anyway, that's the security concept cycle. So risk analysis, your assets are the things you want to protect. Threats are bad things that might happen. Vulnerabilities are weaknesses that might make it possible for one of those threats to actually hurt you. So you take the threat times the vulnerability, for example, and turns out earthquakes are the same risk in Boston and San Francisco. In Boston, there are very few earthquakes, but the buildings are not built up to good standards. So they fall down when they get a small earthquake. In San Francisco, we have earthquakes all the time, but the buildings are safer. So the end result is it's about the same risk. So the impact is the severity. So threat times vulnerability times impact. And of course, for most of us, human life is entirely unacceptable to have people killed. So that's considered essentially infinite impact. You really don't want to do things that allow people to get killed. So it would be nice if you could boil it all down to dollars, but often you can only do it in sort of qualitative terms like high, medium, and low. And so if there's something with insignificant consequences and not very likely, that's a low risk. If there's something with catastrophic consequences, then even if it's unlikely, it's still an extreme risk. And so you can decide which category things are in, and then you know what risks you should be focusing on. So the only math in the CISSP is this thing, and it's not all that important. But if you have an asset value and the exposure factor is how much of the asset will be lost if the threat is realized, then to multiply those, you have the single loss expectancy. Yeah, this is the only math in the CISSP. So, if you have a car that costs $10,000 and the risk you're worried about is getting in an accident, and you figure the accident will ruin half the car, that exposure factor is 50%. So you're going to lose $5,000 in one loss. Then you have the annualized rate of occurrence. How many of those are going to happen per year? So you multiply them together, and that is the annualized loss expectancy. How many dollars per year do we expect to lose from this problem? And then that's dollars you want to spend on the countermeasure. So if you're going to have 10 cars and 1 in 10 of them is going to crash a year, you'll have $5,000 a year of loss. So if you want to do something like buy insurance or send your employees to driver training or something, you should not be spending more than $5,000 doing that. That's the idea. Anyway, total cost of ownership, something Microsoft always talks about. This is everything it really costs you to put in some security. You might think it's cheap enough to install like security cameras, but then you got to have somebody look at the footage and somebody replace the cameras and maintain them and everything. There's the total amount of cost required in putting in some kind of mitigating safeguard. So now you can calculate the return on investment. You take the amount of loss you expect, then you take the amount of loss you expect after putting in the safeguard, and that's the amount of money you saved, and you can compare that to the amount of money you paid to implement the safeguard, and you can decide whether this expenditure of money has a good return on investment or not. But all those numbers are pretty much just hand-waving estimates. All right, in most cases. So you can accept the risk, which means you just do nothing and let it happen. You can mitigate it by putting in some kind of control. You can transfer it to somebody else by outsourcing that business process or by buying insurance or something. And you can avoid the risk by readjusting your business so you no longer do that activity at all. I can say, we're not going to issue cars to our employees anymore. They're all just going to have to ride Uber. There, now that risk is gone. Anyway, so quantitative measures boil it all down to dollars. Qualitative just approximates it as high, medium, and low, which is by far the more common situation. So there's a Nist risk management framework where you can monitor things, categorize them, detect them, implement them, assess, authorize, and go around a circle as always. They all have the same general structure. And so here's your access control types. These are security plus stuff. So preventive controls are the ones that actually block something like a firewall. The packets come in and they don't get through because they're recognized as malicious. So that stops this bad thing from happening. Or limiting privileges. You don't have administrator rights. So when you try to do this thing, it doesn't happen. Detective controls just observe that something bad is happening, but do not prevent it, like surveillance cameras. Corrective controls correct something that's damaged, actually fix some of the harm that was caused. Recovery controls restore functionality after an incident, like from backup, so they're very close to corrective. And deterrent controls scare away attackers, like putting up a sign when there is in fact no dog. But putting up a sign saying beware of dog will scare away some attackers. So this is a very weak defense that's not as strong as a preventive control, but it will stop some attackers. And then there's compensating controls, which is a control to compensate for weakness in another control. And this is how you get into defense in depth, which is essential these days. Long ago, in 2002, Microsoft's official policy was all you need is one firewall on the edge of the network, and then all the machines inside are trusted. But now that's not true at all. Now the machines inside have been carried in with laptops and USB sticks and everything, and they very well could be compromised inside your network. So we now move to the zero trust model, where you don't assume you have a firewall, but you don't assume that everything inside the firewall is clean. You have more controls after that. You have more tests of network traffic and log monitoring to detect what gets through. And you treat it like, your preventions against employee theft or fire. You have fire suppression, but that doesn't mean there'll never be a fire. You have a series of controls. Yeah. And you have SolarWinds Orion. That's the thing. Those supply chain attacks are pretty scary because you have to trust somebody. And when you trust your vendor, then your vendor gets hacked. Yeah, it's pretty annoying. Yeah. Anyway, so those are the 6 types of controls. And then there's another division of them in 3. There's administrative controls, which are business processes like orders and commands and policies. And then there are technical controls like software, antivirus, and things like that. And then physical controls like locks and security guards. And I remember I used to say the cool thing is technical controls because I'm a technical guy and I like things like access controls and software and passwords and everything. I understood that. I said administrative controls are garbage because as far as I can tell, managers and bosses are just idiots that get in the way and we all just ignore them anyway. And then I learned about iPhones. iPhones have no malware. And the reason they have no malware is because of administrative controls. It's not because of the quality of the code. It's because you can only put on apps from the App Store, and humans manage the App Store. And if you put bad stuff in the App Store, they kick you out and you can't sell any more apps. So the administrative controls are the strong thing that keeps the malware off the iPhone. So I was impressed. Properly implemented, administrative controls can be very effective. Anyway, yeah, YubiKeys, I would call them a technical control, I think. But anyway. All right, so now you got threat modeling. I mentioned you have to consider what might hurt you. And there's various ways to do it. You can have an application and then think about what could happen to this application. You could start from your assets, like whatever your crown jewels are, your customer contacts or your proprietary designs or something. Or you can start from the attacker and think, who would attack us and how would they do it? So you identify assets and the threat agents who might attack you, look at the countermeasures you have, consider your vulnerabilities, prioritize the risks, and then identify what recommended new countermeasures there are. And I talk to this a lot to the students in pen testing. If you do a pen test and then you defend your report, you're going to say, we found these a security audit. You find like 100 problems. Well, nobody can fix 100 problems. So what they're really paying you for is this human judgment. Figure out of those 100 problems, which 3 are the high priority ones we should focus on. That's why we pay you. Telling me I have 100 problems is not any good. You need to put them in order so I can actually get somewhere, because that's the point. And that it requires understanding your company and understanding what matters to your company. Microsoft has a stride for threat categorization, spoofing, tampering, and information disclosure, elevation of privilege. These are just ways to list the various bad things that can happen, and there are other similar modeling tools. So this is various versions of it: Stride, Pasta, Trike, and Vast, that all attempt to list and categorize the various bad things that can happen to you. Stride is the one I hear about most. And then, of course, I mentioned the supply chain, like the SolarWinds attack you're talking about, right? All the stuff you use came from somewhere, and this is why people got upset. They say don't use Kaspersky antivirus, because the NSA lost their attack tools because somebody put it on a machine with Kaspersky antivirus that sent it back to Russia. They said, well, U.S. government computers should not have Russian antivirus on them. And we shouldn't be building them with Chinese chips, but we have to because there's no other chips. And there's many kinds of supply chain problems. You buy something, you plug it in, and now you're trusting a bunch of people that built that gadget, and you can't really audit it all. So it's an issue. So you can try to do third-party assessment and monitoring. The military is big on this. This is why they have just a small number of military contractors that they trust, because they like to have a trusted relationship with the vendor, and they meet all these standards, and they don't really want to go with anybody else because they want to stick with the one they trust. And you can have service level agreements that promise that the product they provide will be free of defects or something, and there'll be some punishment if it isn't. But it only goes so far, as we saw in the SolarWinds. If something you really need is really messed up, you're pretty much hosed. Anyway, a company called Adolis is spearheading the SBOM approach for software bill of material. Yes, I've heard about that. Yeah, that's the idea. There are now products coming out to try to address this, and they would like to make the software bill of material so you know who contributed all the parts. And certainly, it's an important issue. I don't know if that particular product is good, but they're right that this is a big issue and people are really worried about it. And they are looking for some way to moderate this risk. So, good. The Coots are coming up. Yeah. All right. Give it a few more seconds. All right. All right. A warning sign. That's a deterrent. Doesn't prevent you from doing anything, but hopefully it makes you think twice. An electrified fence. That's preventive. It stops people from going in there. Yeah. A security camera. Technical detective control. All right. It's technology to detect something. All right. An acceptable use policy. That's administrative. All right. And if risk has a high likelihood and low impact, what should you do? Yeah, you accept it. And by the way, people are saying that one question wasn't very fair. I agree. You could argue it physical or technical. It wasn't entirely clear. And that's part of why I make these Kahoots extra credit, because they're not perfect. But another thing to be aware of is that the actual CISSP exam is incredibly unfair. The questions are much more cruel than this. You will read them and say, what the hell are they talking about? And none of these answers make any sense at all. You really have to get used to it. That's why you must get a practice exam. These questions are crazy, and you have to get used to them. It's not like the the CCNA or Security Plus or any normal exam. The questions are very confusing. Anyway, my questions are not a good imitation of those questions. You need a real practice exam. Anyway, you have 100 cars worth 50K each, and employees wreck 1% of them every year. So what's the annualized loss expectancy? Right. They're going to lose one of them. So that's 50K. All right, good. All right. So B. I know who B is. All right, good. Pi, I don't know who that is. I know who that is, however. Oh, this should be a 3. And this should be a 6. Okay, so I'm going to stop the recording and I'll start posting.